Her behavior exemplifies emotional manipulation and a victim mentality. By criticizing me and claiming that she feels ganged up on and blamed, she shifts the focus away from her labels, her actions, right? And towards eliciting sympathy for herself. This tactic aligns with covert narcissist tendency to play the role of victim and to manipulate situations to do what? To maintain control and avoid any responsibility. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In a prior episode, we explored the concept of covert narcissism, shedding light on its subtle yet impactful traits. Today, we'll build on that foundation and delve even deeper into how to relate to someone with covert narcissistic traits. It's been a long time since I released that episode. It was episode 4. So I'll start with a bit of a refresher. I must say, if we're going to delve deeply into how to relate to someone with these traits, which can be incredibly difficult, we need to have a theory in mind. I will talk briefly about a particular theory that has helped me in my work with these individuals. I must warn you, this is a disclaimer alert. I am not going to talk about the tools and techniques that are commonly touted on various social media platforms when they discuss living with a covert narcissist. Patients come to me after having tried these techniques, and I am not surprised to hear that they're not at all effective. Some of the tools and suggestions include, I'll just do a very quick review, but these include, but are not limited to, establish and enforce clear boundaries, or keep conversations brief and focused. While establishing and enforcing boundaries is crucial for protecting yourself from physical abuse or overt aggression, it may not be as effective in fostering a deeper relationship. Also, keeping conversations brief and focused can help you avoid getting drawn into manipulative or unproductive dialogues, but this approach will limit meaningful communication and the opportunity to address deeper issues within the relationship. Another recommendation or technique is, or tool, recognize and counteract gaslighting. Like, for instance, keep record of events, write things down, and clearly state that you know what happened. And I'm quoting here, "The truth is the truth," unquote. While this may feel important for your mental health and self-awareness, it can create a sense of constant vigilance that, in my opinion, and from what I've seen, undermines trust and intimacy in the relationship. I think this kind of note-taking is good if you're a detective, but in an intimate relationship, it can make interactions feel more like transactions or legal proceedings rather than genuine human connection. This will only further distance you from your partner. In short, the need to document and verify events will erode the nature or the natural flow of the relationship, making genuine connection impossible. However, if you're looking to bring some sort of lawsuit or you're in court with a loved one, then that's a different story. Because what I'm talking about here is how to foster a more meaningful connection with an individual in your life who may have these covert narcissistic characteristics, which I'll describe momentarily. Moreover, I want to go to this one. It's been said that the truth is the truth, and that is why you need to document it. This approach assumes that you are the ultimate authority on what is true. In complex relationships and intense interactions, the idea that there is only one truth can be very problematic. Believing you have a claim on the absolute truth can place you in a position of moral supremacy, which can further erode trust within the relationship. Again, If you insist on being the arbitrator of the truth, it can create a dynamic where your partner feels judged and invalidated. This can lead to defensiveness and resistance, making it even harder to communicate effectively and build mutual understanding, which is the goal. Insisting on a single version of the truth ignores the nuances and subjective experiences that both partners bring to the relationship. This can hinder the development of empathy and compromise. Now, paradoxically, this is actually what the partner of the covert narcissist accuses the narcissist of doing, creating a cycle of mistrust and defensiveness. So what I'm suggesting here is, yes, following these tools actually mimics some of the narcissistic traits and characteristics. Here's another one. Make a list of all the hurtful things your covert narcissistic partner does to you so you can get it out of your head, and therefore you will have room for more positive and affirming thoughts. This approach, from what I've seen, can entrench the negative dynamics of the relationship by constantly reminding you of the hurtful behaviors. It may prevent you from seeing any positive aspects of your partner. See, because you're so busy always documenting just the negatives. And by the way, if I could digress for a moment, in the field of psychoanalysis, in my field, this is what we call splitting. That's when you see something all good or all bad. You're either with me or you're against me. If you are very preoccupied with documenting all the negative events, this is going to further polarize your view of the relationship. Also, if you're taking the time to document all the hurtful things, does this not perpetuate the victim mentality? In other words, keeping a list of grievances can perpetuate a victim mentality where you might feel powerless and stuck in a cycle of blame and hurt. And again, I say this paradoxically, one of the main characteristics of the covert narcissist is that they are always claiming to be the victim. Again, I'm going to review these characteristics in a moment, but this is the paradox, that this is in fact another narcissistic characteristic that's being replicated or mimicked. I hope by drawing your attention to the potential limitations and actual drawbacks of these common recommendations, you can better assess their effectiveness and consider alternative approaches that may foster a healthier or more constructive relationship dynamic. Additionally, the paradoxical comments begin to hint at a painful truth that nobody ever wants to hear. And I'm sorry that I have to say this, but oftentimes there may be two individuals in a relationship struggling with narcissistic characteristics. Recognizing this possibility can be incredibly challenging, but is essential for understanding and addressing the complexities of these relationship dynamics. Let's explore this now, because you may be asking, if these commonly held suggestions or these recommendations are limited in terms of effectiveness, what are some alternative approaches? What am I supposed to do when I simply question my partner or I make a benign recommendation of some sort and they turn it around to make me feel guilty as if I did something wrong? To answer this complicated question, we need to follow a structured approach. First, we will explore the descriptive factors. I mentioned earlier that I would get to that. So I want to start with that because that's going to enable you to identify covert narcissistic traits to ensure we're thinking about the same behaviors and characteristics, because there are many different characteristics, but I'm going to highlight the most prominent ones or the ones that are most difficult to deal with. Then We'll delve into the origins of these traits by briefly examining a psychoanalytic theory, fostering an understanding of why these individuals feel perpetually victimized. Finally, we will explore effective strategies, at least strategies that I have found effective and have been empirically proven. In other words, there's research that demonstrates that these are the strategies that lead to change. These are the strategies for interacting with and helping people who have covert narcissistic characteristics. I apologize in advance, as this is a complex subject matter, and these are some of the most complicated relationships. But to sufficiently answer this question, in terms of what am I supposed to do when I simply answer a question and I get accused of something or I'm blamed, to answer that question, we're going to have to cover this over 2 episodes. So let's consider this to be part 1. And remember, I already did an earlier episode on this, and that's how we could do a whole course on this. But I think 3 episodes, you'll have a really good understanding of the traits, where they come from, and how to effectively relate to somebody who has these characteristics. Okay? So let's get started. What are the defining characteristics of covert narcissism? In other words, how will you know if you're with someone who's struggling with characteristics related to covert narcissism? While both grandiose and covert narcissists share a lack of empathy, a grandiose sense of self, chronic envy, aggressivity, superficial relationships, and a constant need for admiration and attention, there are key characteristics that set covert narcissists apart from their more overt counterparts. For example, here are a few of the predominant covert narcissistic traits. 1. Unlike overt narcissists, covert narcissists are extremely sensitive to criticism and may react with intense sadness, or they may express anger and resentment in more subtle, indirect ways rather than through direct hostility and rage. 2. Covert narcissists use subtle manipulation tactics to maintain control in relationships. This can include passive-aggressive behavior or playing the role of victim. And don't worry, I'm going to give examples of all of these traits in a moment. 3, the victim mentality. This one is critical. They often adopt a victim mentality, perceiving themselves as perpetually wronged or mistreated by others. This perspective allows them to avoid taking responsibility for their actions and to elicit sympathy. And then finally, despite their outward humility or introversion, covert narcissists harbor grandiose fantasies of their own importance and specialness. They believe they are superior to others, even if they don't express it overtly like the grandiose narcissist. From the psychoanalytic literature, this cluster of narcissism is sometimes referred to as, and I quote, the craving instead of the covert, because there's an emphasis on their needy, clinging, demanding, pouting, whining behavior, along with an overall inability to function when they're challenged or when they feel that they are not being fed, being given to, being taken care of. I use the word fed symbolically, but if you listen to my initial episode, going back to episode 4, I give an example of a young woman. When I say a young woman, I mean in her 20s, whose mother actually continued to spoon feed her. Here's a very common clinical example. A couple comes to therapy, and the wife wants to describe her husband's erratic behavior and aggression, she tells me. As she speaks, using labels such as volatile, loses control, and pathological to set the stage for a story that she wants to tell me about her husband's behavior, I notice he's becoming visibly upset. I attempt to slow her down and engage her curiosity as I wonder what she imagines. What impact will these labels have on him? She does not seem to realize how her words might impact him and immediately claims that I don't understand her. I'm judging and being unreasonable because now I'm focusing on her behavior. Meanwhile, the husband feels understood and admits that hearing her describe him in such a way is completely inaccurate and it frustrates him. The wife then criticizes him and then she criticizes me, claiming that she only wanted to show how destructive his behavior is. And now she feels ganged up on and blamed. She feels betrayed and thrown under the bus, with her husband not defending her because he knows he acted aggressively and inappropriately. She argues that she should not have to consider his emotions when recounting his outburst, now claiming that the blame has shifted onto her, even though he was the one who lost his temper. Okay, so I just set the stage. Let's analyze this, okay? This material supports most of the descriptive criteria I just detailed a moment ago. Her hypersensitivity to criticism is apparent when she immediately claims that I'm judging her and being unreasonable by focusing on the words, the labels that she's using. This reaction highlights her own fragile self-esteem, a characteristic of covert narcissists who react intensely to perceived criticism. Her immediate defensiveness suggests a deep-seated sensitivity to how she's perceived and inability to handle feedback constructively. Furthermore, her behavior exemplifies emotional manipulation and a victim mentality. By criticizing me and claiming that she feels ganged up on and blamed, she shifts the focus away from her labels, her actions, right, and towards eliciting sympathy for herself. This tactic aligns with covert narcissist tendency to play the role of victim and to manipulate situations to do what? To maintain control and avoid any responsibility. Her argument that she should not have to consider her husband's emotions when recounting his outburst further showcases her attempt to portray herself as perpetually wronged. Therefore, she is able to avoid any introspection or accountability for her role in the conflict. Additionally, her insistence that her husband is not defending her and her perception of being thrown under the bus can be seen as a manifestation of grandiose fantasies. Despite her outward sort of humility, right? These thoughts reveal an underlying belief that she deserves what? What does she deserve here? Unwavering support and validation, aligning with the covert narcissist hidden sense of grandiosity and specialness. In this scenario, the wife's covert narcissism is characterized, I'm just summarizing now, by hypersensitivity to criticism, emotional manipulation by the way she turned this all around when she was actually labeling and calling him names. She was then the victim, which supports the victim mentality. And there are underlying grandiose fantasies that she should receive unwavering support and validation. Now, the husband's narcissism is evident, and listening to the wife's story might lead most to blame him. See, in other words, if you just stay with the manifest story, most people would just be like, oh, he acted in such a rude way. Yes, he was so aggressive, right? However, her labeling him as volatile, saying he loses control and he's pathological before sharing the story can be stigmatizing and trigger a defensive response. And we wonder, in the argument that she wanted to raise in the session, did she do the same things? Did she label him and trigger a defensive response? Now, the husband's hypersensitivity to criticism, shown by his frustration at these descriptions, and could be an indication of covert narcissism as well. His reaction shifts focus from his behavior, right? So in other words, if we just focus on his reaction and he gets frustrated, then he's shifting it away from his behavior because he probably did get angry with her in this fight, right? So he shifts it away from that, and he then can adopt the victim mentality as well to avoid responsibility and elicit sympathy. Again, common traits among covert narcissists. In other words, he wants to deflect this and say, look at the way she's labeling me, right? That he's the victim. So I hope what I'm beginning to demonstrate here is both individuals exhibit behaviors that could be associated with covert narcissism. These traits complicate genuine relating, making it challenging for you, right, as a partner or in this kind of dynamic to address the issues that you really want to just address without triggering defensive and manipulative responses. In other words, you never even get to address what you wanted to talk about. So if you are in this kind of relationship, if this sounds familiar to you and you feel like your hands are tied, for instance, you are with someone who's highly reactive to your attempts to help them just think about a problem, the question then becomes, how do you relate to this person? Or the question becomes, is it possible, for instance, for this kind of couple to form a closer or more trusting relationship? I find it is always helpful for the therapist to have a theory on what causes the individual to become this way. And I suggest the same thing for anybody in a relationship like this, that you need to have a theory in mind. By exploring the causes, right, then you can tailor the way you're going to speak to, right? The way you're going to address the problem is, see, in other words, if you know the root cause, the root issues, it puts you in a much better position because it sort of cools you down a little bit. And that leads to more effective communication, which then leads to lasting improvements. But the first thing is then we need a theory of, like, for instance, why does somebody become so sensitive like this? That's what's going to help us begin to answer this question, by the way, is how do you relate to a person like this? Now, oftentimes, and you may have heard me say this before in prior episodes, the cause is the cure. You need a theory, in my humble opinion, if you want to adopt a more robust set of tools, not the ones that I outlined at the beginning of this episode. As I mentioned earlier, the commonly touted suggestions are overall pretty ineffective, and I detailed the reasons for their lack of efficacy. Part of the problem is that these suggestions, these tools, are not grounded in a more comprehensive theory. In other words, there's no deep conceptualization of why the covert narcissist behaves this way. If you cannot understand why they are this way, you cannot relate to them. You can only judge or label their behavior as pathological, like we saw in this example that I just gave. When thinking about the cause, what causes someone, for instance, to be so sensitive to criticism, engage in emotional manipulation, and constantly take on the victim mentality? To answer these questions, let's turn our attention briefly to one key piece of a particular theory. I want to focus on the separation individuation process developed by Margaret Mahler, a renowned psychoanalyst. I only want to touch on this briefly because in episode 4, I went into far more detail there. If you have time, I recommend you check out that episode while you are waiting for part 2 of this little mini-series to be released next week. So here's the theory. In short, her theory focuses on the early stages of child development, and in particular, the process by which an infant gradually separates themselves psychologically from their primary caregiver. During these early phases of development, the child experiences a deep connection with the primary caregiver. That's if things go accordingly. And if things go accordingly, this lays the foundation, the groundwork for healthy attachment and the development of a strong sense of self, especially if the caregiver is responsive to the subtle signs, signals, and emotional needs of the developing child. However, if this kind of union, you see, this is like a nice union between the caregiver and the child. If this is ruptured too quickly or prematurely due to inadequate caregiving, it can lead to a vulnerable sense of self and susceptibility to narcissistic wounds. If these narcissistic wounds persist, the main task then of the grown adult, by the way, becomes the reunion of the self with the nourishing, caring, understanding, containing caregiver. So since that's the main task of the grown adult, that's what we need to focus on to answer that question I raised earlier, is how do you relate to somebody like this? In terms of relating, if you can understand the main task is to repair something that was ruptured prematurely, this union, this sense of togetherness, this sense of being deeply understood. We have different names for this. We could call it emotional resonance, affective attunement. I spoke about all these concepts in other episodes, but the main task of the covert narcissist becomes this union between themselves and somebody who's supposed to be there to take care of them. Okay, so that's the particular theory. Now, we need to think about how we can use this theory or how this theory is helpful in terms of either addressing your own covert narcissism or in terms of building a closer relationship with someone you know who has these characteristics. However, we cannot do that today. We have to begin to wrap up things here, but we have now laid down an important foundation. We identified the descriptive factors that help us to recognize covert narcissistic traits. We explored the origins of these traits through a psychoanalytic lens and understood the deep-seated need for reunion in those affected. We also demonstrated how the most commonly touted tools and suggestions are limited in effectiveness without a deeper theoretical understanding. And when I say limited in effectiveness, just to be very clear, if you're looking to exit a relationship or maintain a superficial or a highly conflictual relationship, then the tools such as creating a boundary, keep records of events, write down notes, and clearly state that you know what happened. And I quote again, because I cannot let go of this quote, "The truth is the truth." Like I said, if you're looking to exit the relationship or create a superficial relationship, then these tools have some merit. The tools and techniques that I'm going to share with you in our next episode are practical strategies and therapeutic approaches to help effectively navigate and maintain relationships with covert narcissists, if you're interested in doing that. So stay tuned, and thank you for joining me on this journey toward understanding. Okay, until next time, engage your mind, not your note-taking detective capabilities. Okay, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.